woods, the boys came across a particularly large wych elm, a favorite for birds to make their nests in. One of the young men, a boy named Robert Farmer, was by far the strongest climber among them, and so it was he that scaled the trunk before shimmying among the branches in search of nests to poach. Once he had done so, he discovered that the tree's trunk was actually hollow and extended down many feet. Curious, he peered into the hollow and was greeted by a sight that chilled him to the bone. It was a human skull, complete with human hair and teeth. Robert almost fell out of the tree when he realized what he was looking at. But he was left in a dire predicament indeed, for Hagley Wood was part of the Hagley estate, and the land belonged to Lord Cobham.
Crap.
And the boys were trespassing on his property. If they told anyone what they'd seen, their parents would find out where they'd been, and that might well be way more trouble than what it was worth. And so the boys quickly departed Hagley Wood, pale-faced and shaken, running home to their parents before they began to wonder where they'd gotten to. But that night, one of the boys named Thomas Willett found himself visited by vivid and terrifying nightmares. In them, he saw visions of the woman trapped inside the wych elm, still alive and wailing as the tree grew up around her, holding her in place like some horrible wooden prison. She screamed for him to help, but as much as he tried to, he couldn't, and when he tried to call for help, his voice caught in his throat, and he was rendered silent. Thomas cried out as he awoke from his nightmare, and when his parents arrived in his bedroom to see what had upset him so, he confessed everything. He told them of Hagley Wood, of poaching bird eggs, but most importantly, he told them of the skeleton trapped inside the wych elm. First thing the next morning, Thomas's parents walked down to the local police station to tell them of their son's discovery. Constables ventured out to the wych elm the boys had described, checking the hollow trunk more thoroughly, and found an almost complete skeleton concealed in it. They also found the woman's golden wedding band, as well as some fragments of clothing that were believed to belong to the deceased. The skull itself was seen as valuable evidence, as just as young Robert Farmer had seen, it still had a fairly complete dental pattern, as well as a few tufts of hair that had fallen away from the scalp. The responding constables then combed the area for additional clues as to who or why the woman's body had been interred inside the hollow, and it was as a result of this search they found the remains of a human hand, hidden among the dirt and leaves not too far from the tree itself. It didn't take long for the police to determine that someone had severed the woman's hand before she had been tossed inside of the hollow trunk. A subsequent forensic examination quickly established that the woman had been buried inside the wych elm and had been dead for no longer than a year and a half, making the date of her murder around October of 1941. The examining coroner also discovered a piece of taffeta in her mouth, which suggested that asphyxiation may well have been the cause of the death. Taffeta is a crisp and smooth variety of woven fabric made from silk and polyester. It is considered to be a very high-end kind of fabric, suitable for use in ball gowns and wedding dresses, given that it holds its shape better than many other fabrics. So we can reasonably believe that whoever murdered the woman was either a dressmaker or wealthy enough to be able to afford such expensive fabrics. Also, based on the measurements of the wych elm's trunk, the coroner deduced that she was almost certainly placed inside the hollow when she had been freshly killed, as there was no way that she would have fit inside once rigor mortis had set in. Using the various items found alongside the body, police could make an accurate guess of what the woman might have looked like. However, with the Second World War being in full swing at the time of her death and discovery, there were legions of civilians reported missing due to German bomb raidings, and records were far too vast for them to make a proper identification. Details were cross-referenced with hundreds of missing person reports, but nothing seemed to line up. Additionally, dentists from all over the United Kingdom were contacted in the hopes of identifying the pattern of the woman's teeth, commonly known in dentistry circles as the bite. Yet still, none of their records matched the woman's distinctive tooth pattern, and still her identity remained unknown. Interest and curiosity in the strange case was rife among the general population, who were disturbed as they were intrigued by the ominous details surrounding the woman's murder. Their demands for answers seemed to peak a year later in 1944, when graffiti appeared on the Hagley obelisk, not far from where her body was discovered. It read, "Who put Bella in the witch elm?" But in the years that followed, no definitive answers would surface regarding the murder, but this is unsurprising. The human material resources entire British state was stretched to breaking point in its quest to defeat the evils of Nazism across mainland Europe. And so the question of mysterious murder was most definitely not a top priority of national or local police forces. And so,
here we go.
We are still forced to ask ourselves, did put that woman's dead body in the witch elm of Hagley Wood? There are many prevailing theories as to why the body was placed there, and to whom it belonged.
Oh my heck.
One
Why?
possibility is that the body was
Every
found by a
freaking time?
prostitute who was only reported missing in 1944, having apparently disappeared 3 years earlier. The report stated that her name was Lubella, which leads us to the disturbing realization that whoever daubed the graffiti on the Hagley obelisk must have known of the victim's identity, or that of the murderer, long before she was ever properly identified. Another theory involves a patient of the Stafford Mental Hospital by the name of Jack Mossop. Mossop regularly complained to the hospital staff of reoccurring nightmares involving a woman staring out at him from a tree. Jack died long before the body was ever discovered, but 10 years after his death, at a time when the Witch Elm story was well entrenched in the public's consciousness, his wife came forward with information that he had been involved. The woman, Una Mossop, said her husband had once confessed that he and a friend had been drinking in the Littleton Arms, a public house located in Hagley, when they had found themselves being hectored by a particularly drunk woman who demanded they buy her a drink. The men had ended up giving her a lift home in their motor car when she had thrown up all over the back seat.
That was
To
lucky.
teach her a lesson, they had hauled her drunken body into the woods and thrown her into the hollow of a tree, hoping it would frighten her into the seeing the error of her own ways. But unless they had outright murdered her or she had died of exposure while trapped inside the hollow trunk, there are no reasons to believe the ravings of a madman who had later been interned into a mental hospital. And if that was indeed the truth of the matter, why had they severed her hand before doing so? However, there was another theory put forward in 1945 by an anthropologist and archaeologist from University College London, named Margaret Murray. Professor Murray's suggestion is perhaps by far the most disturbing of all the possible theories regarding Bella's disappearance and death, and involves something that was long thought to be eradicated by the British Isles: witchcraft. Professor Murray stated that
give me a
the
few
fact that Bella's
spots.
hand was severed makes the details of the murder consistent with an arcane ritual known as the Hand of Glory, which according to her could well have been performed by a group of local gypsies. According to old European folklore, a lit candle made of the fat from one who had died an unnatural death, then placed in their own severed hand as if in a candlestick, would serve as a powerful magical talisman. The Hand of Glory would render anyone to whom it was presented unable to move. This candle could be put out only with milk. The hair
Nerve-wracking.
of the dead person was to be used as a wick, and the candle would give light only to whoever was holding it. Around the same time as her assertion,
Yeah, we're doing pretty good now. Doing pretty good now. 11th place is not bad.
Professor Murray linked the murder to the slaying of a man named Charles Walton, who was murdered in a similarly ritualistic fashion in the nearby area of Quinton. 75-year-old Charles Walton had been pruning hedges and undertaking other, generally gardening work on Valentine's Day of 1945, when he had been set upon by a mysterious assailant. The murderer had been beaten by Dr. Walton over the head with his own walking stick, then cut his neck open with a slash hook and driven the prongs of Walton's own pitchfork into either side of his neck, pinning him to the ground. Mr. Walton's left hand had been
Are you
severed,
kidding me?
and despite
How did I
many
fall from
thorough
that?
searches of the area was never found. Detective Superintendent Robert Fabian of the Metropolitan Police was sent to investigate the grisly murder and wrote the following of his discoveries. I advise anybody who is tempted at any time to venture into black magic, witchcraft, shamanism, call it what you will, to remember Charles Walton and to think of his death, which was clearly the ghastly climax of a pagan rite. There is no stronger argument for keeping as far away as possible from the villains with their swords, incense, and mumbo-jumbo. It is prudent, on which your future peace of mind and even your life could depend. Fabian also claimed to have spoken to many Quinton residents who believed that Walton was a witch whose powers were feared by some villagers.
Oh, I knew that was going to happen.
Evil eye and kept navigating birds as pets, using them to blight the crops and livestock of local farmers. Just one example cited by locals.
Ooh, he's
was
probably
the
so
failure of the
mad.
1944 harvest. It was claimed that this alleged witchcraft led him to be murdered in a ritualistic manner which involved his blood soaking in the garden to replenish the soil's fertility, and that his hand had been taken to perform a hand of glory ritual. Robert Fabian's investigation into the murder also led him to work with Detective Superintendent Alex Spooner, head of Warwickshire CID. It was Spooner who was said to have drawn Fabian's attention to a book entitled
Can't Beat
Folklore, Old Customs and Superstitions in Shakespearean Land, written by the Reverend James Harvey Bloom and published in 1929. The book included an apparently true story set in 1885 of how a young plowboy had been seen to summon a ghostly black dog on several consecutive nights, and how at one point the dog had been accompanied by a headless woman. Fabian was said to be disturbed beyond belief when he discovered that the name of this plowboy was none other than Charles Walton. Fabian was also in later years to suggest that he had been met with a wall of silence when he tried to get to the bottom of the murder, telling the press in 1945
That's
that
what you get, dude.
the natives of Upper and Lower
Trying to take me
Quinton
out.
and the surrounding district are of a secretive disposition, and they do not take easily to strangers. Whether or not the two murders are actually connected is completely undecided, but the fact that two ritualistic murders were committed just a few years apart and so close to each other is something we absolutely cannot ignore. Since the 1970s, some have even suggested that Bella had been killed because of her involvement in a German spy ring, but each theory put forward had been subsequently disproved. The only one that has categorically not been ruled out is the one with occult connotations. The mysterious Bella may well have been murdered as part of an ancient pre-Christian ritual, just as Charles Walton had been. But one thing may never be decided upon is just exactly who severed her hand before putting her still warm body in that witch elm of Hagley Wood.
Oh, come on.
There is a place in western Norway, near to the city of Bergen, known as Isdalen, or Ice Valley. But the place has another name too, Dødsdalen, or Death Valley. Death Valley earned its name from the huge number of steep, sheer cliffs which, in another age, were known among the hardy Nordic populace as Ættestupa. These were places where elderly members of society who were no longer capable of caring for themselves and thus considered a burden could commit a kind of ritual senocide. When it was decided it was their time, older folks would be assisted in climbing the peaks of the Ættestupa, where they would then throw themselves into the valley below for what was hoped to be a quick and painless death. But sometimes, fear of the end would overwhelm them, and it was then that their accompaniment would give them the little push they needed to complete the ritual. It was here, in such a grim, foreboding landscape, that a Norwegian father decided to take his two daughters hiking in November of 1970. The trio were hiking along the popular trails of Ulriken, the highest of the 7 mountains that surrounded the city of Bergen, on their way to the restaurant that sits on the mountain's highest peak. Whilst on their way up, one of the man's daughters smelled a burning smell coming from nearby, but they were not nearly high enough for the smell to be from the restaurant, and the trio soon found themselves in search of the source of the scent. One of the girls bounded over a rise, and when she laid eyes on what was emanating such a horrid and acrid smell, she screamed. There, lying among a collection of broken rock fragments at the base of a craggy mountain cliff, lay the body of a woman, laying face up on her back, charred beyond all recognition. The trio rushed back into town, hurrying to inform the local police force of what they had located. The 2 young girls, thoroughly traumatized by what they'd seen, went home to their mothers to recover, while the father led police back to the place the woman's burned body lay. Soon an investigation was underway. Upon their inspection, the first thing the police noticed about the scene surrounding the woman's body were a number of items that seemed like they had been arranged in a very particular way. All had scorch marks on them, suggesting that they had been exposed to the same fire that had charred the woman's corpse. These included a few pieces of jewelry, a wristwatch, a woolen jumper and scarf, a pair of rubber boots, some nylon stockings, a purse, a plastic passport cover, 2 plastic water bottles, an umbrella, an empty bottle of cheap liquor, a matchbox, and some sleeping pills. Beneath the body was a fur that was found to have traces of gasoline on it. The police also noted that each of the items had been scrubbed of any personal identifiers. A few days later, 2 suitcases were found to be abandoned at Bergen railway station. When they were inspected, staff found what appeared to be a regular set of travelers' luggage. Inside were clothes, cosmetics, and a purse containing currency from a couple of different European countries. Only something was unusual about the items, as all the brand labels and personal identifiers had been either removed or scratched off. Also among the items was a notepad that contained what appeared to be a coded message. When this was reported to the local police, they determined that both suitcases must have belonged to the burned woman. Yet there was still the question of who she was, or why someone would wish to travel with such anonymity. An autopsy conducted at the nearby Auckland University Hospital found the mysterious woman had died from a combination of 2 things. Firstly, analysis of her blood and stomach showed that she had inhaled a fatal amount of carbon monoxide, as well as having consumed around 60 sleeping pills, well over the safe dosage for barbiturates. However, her lungs were found to contain a considerable amount of soot, meaning she had been still alive when she was placed in whatever fire had scorched her beyond recognition. She also had bruises around her neck, indicating that she had struck or had been gripped extremely hard, possibly to drag or push her into the fire. Since her identity was still unknown at that point, tissue samples were taken, and her jaw was removed because of the uniquely patterned gold fillings that she had in her teeth. It was hoped that somewhere a dentist may have been able to recognize the work, and thus piece together who she was. Since the Norwegian police were still not closer to discovering who the burned woman was, a national appeal was launched, urging members of the public to come forward if they had any information regarding the woman's movements or identity. Composite sketches, based on a forensic analysis of the woman's facial structure, were swiftly circulated via national newspapers and TV stations. It was then that staff members of the Hotel Hordaheim, a local Bergen hotel, came forward having recognized the woman from the sketches. According to them, they saw the woman on November 23rd, having just checked out of room 407. They told police that she was an attractive 30 to 40-year-old, staying around 5'4", with dark brown hair and similarly colored eyes. She had claimed to be a traveling saleswoman, dealing in rare antiques and artifacts. They also noted that she appeared to be extremely nervous, keeping to her room and barely interacting with other guests or hotel staff. One member of staff in particular mentioned that she was almost certain that the one time she had seen the woman interacting with another guest, she did so speaking in German. They also noted that she only ever paid for things in cash, and at one point asked to change rooms, giving a spurious explanation as to why she needed to do so. Around the same time as these first few pieces of information were coming out, Norwegian homicide detectives were also having a breakthrough regarding the coded message in the woman's notepad. Cryptologists had come to the conclusion that the codes were a list of locations the woman had visited, along with the dates and times of the visits. Once these were cross-referenced with handwritten check and forms at various hotels, detectives were able to determine that the mystery woman had traveled extensively around Europe under a variety of fake names, using a series of forged documents, all the while claiming to be a Belgian citizen. Another set of hotel staff came forward not long after, but this time, they claimed that the woman was blonde and spoke Flemish during her one rare interaction with another guest. After months of investigation and a huge amount of resources poured into the inquiry, all hope of identifying the woman was lost, and the case seemed to be destined to remain unsolved. Despite strong evidence to the contrary, authorities were forced to conclude that the burned woman had ended her own life. since she had ingested a huge quantity of sleeping pills. And so, on February 5th, 1971, the mysterious burned woman was buried in an unmarked grave in Bergen's Molendal Cemetery. Only a handful of the Bergen police force were in attendance, and it appeared that all of her secrets would be buried with her. But since then, a number of theories and developments came to the fore, which may well shed more light on who exactly she was, and why she had to die in such a violent, untimely manner. Naturally, due to the highly suspicious circumstances surrounding the woman's death, it wasn't long before some people suspected a cover-up, instigated by the Norwegian National Criminal Investigation Service. Given that the incident occurred during the height of the Cold War, some believe that the woman was some kind of spy, and indeed, the 9 fake passports found in her possession pointed to the involvement of a highly effective and professional organization. There is also the fact that the woman's murder could be linked to a number of other mysterious disturbances that had taken place in 1960.
Thunder Valley.
Each had taken
There we
place
go.
close to a military base, and had since been irrefutably linked into international espionage activities. In more recent times, declassified Norwegian national defense records had revealed that the woman's movements throughout Europe seemed to mirror top-secret tests of the new Penguin missile, a medium-ranged, guided anti-ship missile that was set to be the bane of the Soviet Navy should the Cold War suddenly turn hot. This has been supposedly backed up by the eyewitnesses' testimony of the Norwegian fisherman, who has since claimed that he recognized composite sketches of the woman,
Dude.
having seen her while observing military
Come on.
exercises around the Norwegian city of Stavanger. However, after 35 long years of half-truths and dead ends, a witness finally came forward with perhaps the most significant piece of information to date. A resident of the city of Bergen came forward in 2005 after seeing one of the composite sketches put together in the initial aftermath of the charred body's discovery. He claimed that the drawing of the woman's face was uncannily similar to that of a woman that he had seen around 5 days before the scorched body was found. He had been hiking on another one of the mountains that surrounded Bergen called Fløyen, when he noticed a person in rather unusual attire. Instead of the standard warm and waterproof outdoor wear as is normally worn by hill hikers, he saw a woman dressed in light, casual clothing. According to the man's testimony, she seemed resigned, even melancholy, and for a moment seemed as if though she might say something to him, although she never did. It was then that the man noticed that the woman was being followed by 2 men wearing warm, heavy coats that had a distinctly foreign look to them. When pushed as to what exactly he meant by this, the man claimed they had very dark hair and eyes and were engaged in an intense conversation that they immediately ceased once they detected his presence further up the trail. The man also claimed he had gone to the police once the national inquiry had been launched to report the encounter, but was visited by high-ranking Norwegian security officers who had told him to forget about what he'd seen. Obviously, the man's account gives a large amount of credence to the idea that there was some kind of cover-up over the Isdale woman's death, especially when coupled with the overwhelming evidence that she was in fact murdered and had not actually taken her own life. There are many unanswered questions regarding the Isdale woman, and as the years go by, it seems less and less likely that we will ever have the answers to them. But what seems abundantly clear is that she didn't die of her own volition. More often than not, those that take their own lives leave a note of some description, explaining why they did so, or at least as a means to say the last goodbyes to those who are dear to them. It is invariably a solitary act. They do not carry spare clothes with them. They do not scrub their belongings of identifiers, and they most certainly do not set themselves on fire whilst incapacitated. We can safely conclude that the Isdale woman was murdered in some way, and what was becoming increasingly clear is that someone, or some collection of individuals, has done everything in their power to bury the investigation, as well as her true identity. So about 5 years ago, I, a 26-year-old male, set out to travel the world. Being straight out of college had left me in debt, ever more desperate for any job I was overqualified for and generally depressed. I felt isolated and alone in my small town in Washington and found the only way to get out was to travel. My high school buddies suggested I look into woofing and volunteer as a way to travel cheap, and so I did. The way it works is quite simple. You work for around 25 hours a week on some farm for food and housing. The draw is that since the community of cheap travelers is quite big, it's a great way to meet new people, get outside of your comfort zone, and just let yourself live and figure life out. Fast forward 8 months, and I am a seasoned cow poop shoveler. I started out in Washington, Oregon, and went south to California. There I was able to save some money, I was paid under the table for some extra work, and was now faced with a decision: where to go in the world. The excitement of being able to purchase a ticket to almost anywhere in the world got the best of me, and on the advice of my dumb hippie volunteering partner, I chose it at random. I went to a randomizer website and clicked the country button. Georgia. The country of Georgia. To say I didn't know anything about it was an understatement, but the fear of the unknown made it exciting and exotic somehow, and so I did it. I purchased a ticket and started browsing for a farm that could host me. There were few options, and most were remote and hadn't even an internet connection. I messaged every single one, because few ever responded, and got a response from one farm on top of a mountain. The pictures showed a traditional Georgian stone house with a large garden out in the back, a family with several cheerful children, grandparents having dinner, animals. It seemed warm and inviting. The description was written in good English, and the requirements for work seemed reasonable. I was excited. After I flew into Tbilisi, the capital, I followed the directions that they had sent to locate the farm, which wasn't an easy task. Few in Georgia speak English. The roads are messed up since few have been maintained since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country is generally poor. It took me around 20 hours of Soviet buses and taxis, weird serpentine roads and paths to get to that desired blue pin on my map. It was a dirt path leading up a steep hill into a national park up in the north of the country. It was nothing for miles on end but trees in their silence. As I got up the hill, I saw the house about half a mile away on an even steeper hill surrounded by the trees. From that viewpoint, it seemed abandoned, overgrown, brown, and dreary. As I walked past the gate, Geary, the apparent owner, approached me. He was the heavy, small, middle-aged guy with a big smile on his face. He shook my hand and in broken English started to show me around. He also smelled of booze. As he was showing me around, I noticed that there wasn't anyone there but us. I asked about his wife and kids, and he brushed that aside and said something to the extent, "They're away right now." By this point, I am creeped out. From browsing around, it was apparent that the farm was in deep decline. Apple trees and crops were dying. The roof of the small barn caved in, the house itself full of trash and smelling of mold. It was obvious that Geary was going through a rough patch, but I wasn't going to turn around and just leave in the middle of nowhere without a plan, having not slept for the past 36 hours. It was evening, and after feeding me well and trying as best as he could to hold a conversation in English, Geary showed me to my room on the second floor, and I went to sleep. I almost immediately blacked out from the exhaustion and stress, and would have slept for 10 hours if I wasn't awoken by a strange noise in the middle of the night. I sounded like something metallic and heavy being dragged across the wooden floor. In that sleepy in-between state, I listened to it for a few minutes, thought nothing of it, and went back to sleep once it stopped. In the morning, Geary, now sober and grumpy, asked me to repair some of the windows and doors in the house, as he himself planned to go and fetch some components in a nearby village. Again, I got this weird feeling creeping down my spine. Something wasn't right. He didn't maintain eye contact and was evasive. There was no cell reception, no internet. Once he left, I checked around the house to get a general idea of the place, and it became apparent that the place was hardly ever lived in, like one of those abandoned houses. There was broken furniture, newspapers and old photos on the floor, a shattered mirror. I took my phone and looked through the saved listing again. The photos didn't match neither the backyard, the garden, or the walls. Geary wasn't in any of them. It was a completely different house. Now by this point, I am full-blown panicking. I pack my stuff and start to leave when I see a group of 3 men going up that first hill. There aren't any other paths I can take, so I go behind the house and rush down this hill into the forest. After some time, I stop and listen. I hear them in the house. They're clearly looking for me. Afraid of making any noise, I remain still, hidden behind a bush. I don't know how long I waited, but they were persistent. At some point, I hear them leave, so I count until some large number and proceed back into the house and path. And once I find it's all clear, I book it out of there. Never ran this fast again. And I'm still in the middle of nowhere. No traffic, no public transport. I reach a paved road and start walking in the general direction from where I remember coming. Hours go by and finally a car drives by and stops. Now in a horror movie this would have been Geary and his friends, but this was actually a really nice Russian family that gave me a ride to town. The listing disappeared from the website in a few days after I left, and I haven't heard from Geary since. I've yet to make sense of that experience. I've traveled since and volunteered too. Some people, once they hear this story, laugh and say that the guy was coming over with a couple of friends from the village to have a chat over a few beers. Some say he was bound to kidnap and kill me. But I trust my gut feeling. Something was really not right. So I hope to God I never meet Geary and his friends again. Jonathan Luna was born on October 21st, 1965 in New York City, son to a Filipino father and an African-American mother, and spent his formative years in the Patterson Housing Project near Yankee Stadium in the South Bronx. Jonathan
Oh my
was
God.
to be, not only being the first in his family to go to college,
Doing so good.
first-class undergraduate degree in law from Fordham University. He later studied at the University of North Carolina School of Law, where he was roommates with Reggie Shufford, who would later go on to be executive director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania. During the 90s, Luna worked at Arnold and Porter in Washington, D.C., as well as the Federal Trade Commission, serving as a prosecutor in the Brooklyn borough of New York City before moving to Baltimore, Maryland to become an assistant United States attorney. Luna married obstetrician Angela Hopkins on August 29, 1993, and together they had 2 children. They were the modern nuclear family, leading joy-filled lives for many years. That was until tragedy struck, a tragedy that would raise many questions in the years to come. While Jonathan was employed as an assistant United States attorney in Elkridge, Baltimore, his focus was on the highly noble task of convicting violent predators for their heinous crimes that they perpetrated. It was on the morning of the 4th of December 2003 that Jonathan left his home and headed to the office. The case he was involved with at the time revolved around 2 individuals who were suspected of dealing heroin out of their record label studios, known almost comically as Stash House Records. One of these men also happened to be facing a charge for homicide. Jonathan worked all day and late into the evening on a plea deal that was about to offer for one of the supposed studios, finally calling one of his colleagues around 9 that night to inform them that he was only just about to head back home. Yet according to the office's time clock, Jonathan didn't actually leave until around 20 minutes to midnight, and although he required prescription glasses to drive, he left them behind at the office. Information taken from CCTV cameras and Luna's credit card records indicate that he drove to the state of Delaware at around 1 in the morning, where he withdrew $200 from an ATM machine. He then drove through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, where his credit card was used once again to withdraw cash from a bank machine. Luna's Easy Pass had been recorded as being used, but for some reason, after entering Delaware, he started to purchase toll tickets. The following morning, at around 5:30, an employee of Sensen Egan Weaver, a well drilling company in Denver, Pennsylvania, spotted the vehicle parked up behind the main building. He saw that blood had been smeared over the door and front fender, as well as there being a puddle of blood on the back seat. There was blood-stained cash all around the vehicle's interior. The drilling worker quickly called the police, and after a brief search of the area, Jonathan's dead body was found in a nearby creek. He had suffered more than 30 stab wounds and inflicted with his own
13th place, 2 minutes and 31 seconds was my best time.
Yet the actual cause of death was drowning from having fallen into the creek itself. Due to the puddle of blood in the back seat of the vehicle, investigators deduced that Luna had sustained the majority of
So
his
I'm
wounds
only
while seated
20
there. Police also found unidentified
3
fingerprints in the blood,
seconds off
including
the
unidentified
fastest
blood, which
time.
indicated that he was living not alone back there, but that he had actually fought against his assailant before succumbing to his wounds. This is where the case gets weird. Very weird. At first, the death was ruled an obvious homicide, one in which whoever had attacked Jonathan had initially been repelled by the man's own knife, before wresting it from him and using it to take his life. However, an FBI agent ordered the pathologist in charge of the post-mortem to chance his verdict to him ending his own life, despite the fact that Luna had wounds to his back that he could not possibly have inflicted on himself. Then a series of bizarre rumors involving Luna began to circulate around the media, some which asserting that he was involved in the embezzlement of $36,000. A reporter from the Baltimore Sun received an anonymous tip that Luna was also terrified of being found that he had ended his own life, though the source would provide absolutely no evidence of this. But there was also ample evidence that Luna was building a strong case against a ring of violent predators, some of which were employed at high levels of the federal government. It is possible that he was assassinated as a result of this very investigation. And why in the world would an FBI agent have such an obvious example of murder ruled as him ending his own life? We may never know just why such a good man was murdered in such a violent fashion, but what's clear is that no one has ever been convicted or even arrested for his involvement in that death. And given that there must have been ample forensic evidence, this makes for some very disturbing implications indeed. In 2004, in the sleepy Chicago suburb of Aurora, Illinois, Amy Pitson would give birth to her firstborn son. After some deliberation, she and her husband James would name the boy Timothy. The first 6 years of the boy's life were happy and uneventful, and we have every reason to believe that he was loved and well looked after by his two young parents. He had an extensive collection of relatives that he visited regularly, who cared for the boy just as much as his own parents did. But Timothy and his family were headed towards a tragedy that would confound and puzzle all that became familiar